America has a noble tradition of honoring its fallen soldiers. A military funeral is a nation's ultimate display of reverence, dignity, and respect. As an ongoing tribute, military cemeteries are meticulously maintained. Arlington National is considered to be the preeminent military cemetery in America. However, the largest repository of military dead is at the Long Island National Cemetery. Acres of headstones tally the price of liberty. William E. Rhodes is director of Long Island National.
Long Island National Cemetery is the largest national cemetery by numbers of interments. We have a little over 343,000 people buried here. It is a very busy cemetery. We still do almost 1,900 burials a year after 33 years. So it does keep us busy. I have 30 employees, mostly veterans, $6.4 million budget. Our job is to maintain all of these grave sites. Those veterans it truly is veterans taking care of veterans.
On Memorial Day, a flag is placed at each and every headstone by an army of volunteers.
When we reach a point in our country where we no longer care for the grave sites of our heroes, then we have a bigger problem in our country than who's going to care for our loved ones' grave sites. We're passionate about taking care of the grounds. This is the most expensive burial in the world. The good news is the veterans already paid for it with a service to our country.
America also honors its heroes by erecting monuments, like Grant's Tomb, the Marine Corps War Memorial, with its iconic statue dedicated to the heroes who fought and died on Iwo Jima, the inspirational Wall of Honor for the deceased veterans of Vietnam, and situated between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial, the majestic tribute to veterans of the Second World War. No monument is more revered than the tomb of the unknown soldier. An honor guard pays tribute 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Monuments and military cemeteries like these endure because the government is an inexhaustible financial resource. How are other cemeteries maintained? As long ago as 13 centuries BC, Egyptians perfected the art of embalming the body. They believed their remains had to be preserved in order to proceed to an afterlife. The mummy was placed in an ornate sarcophagus fashioned of wood, or it was sealed in stone to insulate it from the elements. This process, however, was reserved mostly for the wealthy and the elite. Ordinary citizens were merely buried in limestone pits. For the pharaoh, Egyptians constructed elaborate tombs to immortalize him and to preserve his worldly possessions for use in the afterlife. Other cultures chose to cremate their dead. The practice dates back to early civilization. Beatrice Lewandowski is president-elect of the New York State Funeral Directors Association.
Cremation isn't new. History can date the process back to the Stone Age, and most of us can recall our school lessons of the old, well-known Viking funerals. Cremation was practiced by the early Romans, the Greeks, and throughout a lot of Northern Europe.
Christianity altered the dynamic of disposition. As the Catholic Church spread throughout Europe, it decreed that parishioners had to be buried in sanctified grounds, namely the churchyard. Other Christian churches followed suit. Early settlers of the United States emulated the European tradition of utilizing the churchyard as the graveyard. In some rural areas far removed from a church, families reserved a plot on their homestead for burial. Cremation was not a viable option in the United States until the early 19th century. At the Brooklyn Diocesan Center, Monsignor Michael J. Reed addresses the Catholic Church's position.
The preference of the early church was to have in-ground traditional burial as we know it today. because cremation at the time was viewed as a pagan custom. And so you would have Christians being buried in the catacombs, sometimes to hide the bodies from those who would want to desecrate them when members of the church were under attack for their position in what was, in their mind, to the local community, a new religion. This started as a practice and imitation of Christ himself. Scripture tells us that Christ was buried in the tomb, and the ritual for Catholic burial reminds us that because Christ was buried for 3 days, he sanctified the graves of everyone, and Catholics are called to imitate that by being buried in the ground with a traditional burial, where we await our call to the resurrection.
As populations grew and the encroachment of commercial space intensified, the churchyard could no longer accommodate the dead. Not in urban areas like Manhattan, where industrialization and looming skyscrapers limited expansion, nor in suburbia, where heavily trafficked boulevards intersected with streets to wall off the churchyard's perimeter. As the capacity of local urban cemeteries was taxed, land was acquired in the adjoining counties to widen a network of cemeteries. In the shadow of New York City, dedicated tracts of land were set aside, such as Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn, Calvary Cemetery across the East River in Queens, St. Raymond's at the southern tip of the Bronx, and St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village. They took the form of planned, picturesque park-like environments. The Catholic Church acquired a 230-acre parcel in Westchester County to establish Gate of Heaven Cemetery. With recent expansion, it can last another 7 to 10 years. In Suffolk County, St. Charles was able to expand its capacity with the acquisition of adjacent property. In contrast, Washington Cemetery, situated in the middle of Brooklyn, is unable to expand and therefore closed to all further in-ground burials. In New York State alone, there are 1,800 not-for-profit cemeteries and 4,000 cemeteries owned by religious groups. Funerals are wrenchingly emotional rituals. Burying a loved one is a somber, heartbreaking ordeal. To some, a cemetery is a dreary reminder of their own mortality. For others, a cemetery is an island of tranquility, a peaceful, reverential sanctuary, or simply a quiet place to commune with loved ones who have passed on. The living grieve and commune in personal ways. Even among the cremated, survivors often create a shrine to share their thoughts and remind themselves of happier times. But for how many generations does this communion last? Not all of society's deceased are revered or remembered. Naked headstones eroded by time are testament to the fleeting nature of remembrance, yet stand as stark reminders that they were members of society and once mattered to someone. They also remind us that unless there is a continuing source of revenue, cemeteries will close or fall into disrepair. There are cemeteries dedicated exclusively to serve members of their faith: Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and Quaker. They are supported and maintained by their respective faith-based congregations. One unique faith-based cemetery is on the campus of a New England college adjacent to its chapel. A distinguished soldier is buried there. Father Joseph T. O'Callahan was a chaplain aboard the USS Franklin when it was set ablaze by enemy bombs during World War II. With utter disregard for his own safety, he organized and led teams to fight the fires and to jettison live ammunition. He administered last rites to the dead and dying. For his acts of bravery and valor, Congress awarded him the Medal of Honor, the first Navy chaplain ever so honored. On this campus, he is revered by all who know of him and his epic heroism. He lies now in a quiet place, resting among his fellow Jesuit faculty. This cemetery will endure so long as the college exists. There are cemeteries that flourish despite having no religious affiliation. Examples of non-sectarian cemeteries are Cypress Hills Cemetery, Locust Valley Cemetery, and Pine Lawn Memorial Park. These meticulously manicured cemeteries are maintained through a continuing source of revenue, namely new interments. But what happens when a cemetery has no more space available for burial?
My father was a veteran. He was buried at Camp Butler National Cemetery in Illinois. And we had a talk before my father passed away, and he had a private gravesite available in a city cemetery in a family plot. And we talked about the economics of taking care of a cemetery. And this isn't a slam against a private cemetery, but you can only maintain a cemetery as long as you have money coming in. When there's no more grave spaces available for sale, when there's no more services for you to sell, when a cemetery is completely buried out, there's no more money coming in. Someone has to care for those. It's simple economics.
Some cemeteries are maintained in excellent condition despite the fact that they are closed to further in-ground burial. Trinity Church stands in the center of Manhattan's financial district, an historic testament to the founders of a new nation. Like most urban churches of its era, skyscrapers have circumscribed and limited its expansion. Congregation Shearith Israel maintains the oldest Jewish cemetery in New York. It was established over 300 years ago and is located in a Manhattan district known as Chinatown. It is an historical landmark situated in the shadows of apartment buildings and bounded by a busy thoroughfare. Most passers-by are unaware of its existence. The histories of those who were interred in this sanctuary are well known to its congregation. On Memorial Day, the cemetery gate is opened and a color guard ushers in the congregation. Led by one of its rabbis, congregants and a few descendants of the deceased take turns placing a flag at the base of each headstone. They respectfully remember the exploits and deeds of these veterans of the Revolutionary War and heroes of the yellow fever epidemic that once gripped New York. It is as much a celebration of life as it is a memorial service. Rabbi Shalom Morris explains why Congregation Shearith Israel maintains its cemetery.
Part of what it means to be Jewish is really having a very long memory. Being a religion that's 3,500 years old, we recognize our major part in what has brought us to be where we are today are those that have come before us, and both their sacrifices and their contributions to maintaining their Jewish identity regardless of where they've traveled. So we continue to maintain the cemetery as a way of recognizing and appreciating those that have come before us and what they've done to establish Jewish life here in America, but really to help establish the United States of America itself through their contributions in the Revolutionary War and in general in American civil and social life.
As long as the congregation exists, the cemetery will be maintained with an enduring commitment to the legacy of the people interred here. The Manhasset Quaker Meeting was founded in 1720. The current landmark structure was erected in 1812 using timbers from the original building. It is framed by a centuries-old white oak, one of Long Island's oldest trees, and is home to a well-manicured cemetery. In stark contrast to the welcome of the Manhasset Meeting, another Quaker cemetery is situated deep within Prospect Park in the heart of Brooklyn. While it is an historical treasure, it is a singularly private, almost clandestine cemetery meticulously maintained by the Society of Friends. But it is seldom open to the public. Not a stone's throw from the United States Courthouse, construction workers unearthed a gravesite while excavating for a federal office building. It proved to be the oldest and largest pre-revolutionary African cemetery in America. To honor the memory of the forgotten slaves, the Government Services Administration redesigned the building so that a magnificent granite monument could be erected on the site. It is both allegorical and awe-inspiring. The central sunken circular courtyard is inscribed with cultural and spiritual images from Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and other areas of the African diaspora. The African Burial Ground National Monument is managed by the National Park Service and will forever preserve the history of slavery and honor its legacy. Situated on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, surrounded by apartment houses and brownstones, is the oldest non-sectarian graveyard in New York. The Marble Cemetery is a walled enclave accessible through an alley that is guarded at each end by a wrought iron gate. There are no headstones in this park-like environment. The deceased are interred in coffins hewn of Tuckahoe marble, their names inscribed in stone on the wall of the cemetery. Caroline Dubois is a trustee.
The trustees of New York Marble Cemetery are responsible for maintaining our cemetery, but we in fact hire a gardener who comes in here every week and mows the lawn and takes care of a lot of the picking up of trash. Our overall budget is under $10,000 a year, but that includes half of it is to pay the gardener, and the other half is for such things as newsletter, insurance, legal representation, new locks and keys. That doesn't include building the wall, which is another enormous expense. We have an endowment, a very small endowment, but we ask descendants of the original owners to send us checks, and then we also hold events like weddings or Shakespeare plays or cocktail parties to pay for some of our expenses.
Just 1 block distant, but unrelated, is the New York City Marble Cemetery, founded in 1831. Behind a magnificent wrought iron fence lays an expanse of land that bears many marble cemetery characteristics. An open field with no headstones, an encircling stone wall, and subterranean vaults also carved of Tuckahoe marble. Many notable historical figures were buried here, including ex-President James Monroe. He was later disinterred and reburied in his native Virginia. In a quiet residential Brooklyn neighborhood, a serene private cemetery in a centuries-old corner plot is home to Revolutionary War dead. It is a maintained garden oasis among row houses, an understated yet constant reminder of sacrifices made for this country. At the other end of the spectrum, there are abandoned cemeteries, regrettably, that are not maintained because they receive no private or institutional financial support. On upstate farms, disintegrating headstones are all that remain in abandoned burial plots. A patch of land by a rural road in Connecticut, all but forgotten. Gravestones tilting against the elements, inscribed with a monotony of surnames, are all that remain in a family plot. A forgotten cemetery older than 200 years sits by a remote country road. Crumbling, encrusted headstones betray a legacy of disrepair and decay. Random flags are lonely demonstrations of homage to veterans of the Spanish-American War, and the county tries to maintain these decrepit gravesites with a constrained budget. Yet it demonstrates its respect by displaying a sentinel flag. In Connecticut, there are 2,200 known cemeteries, some of which date to colonial times and the Civil War. A centuries-old copper beech tree crowns Lakeside Cemetery in East Hampton, Connecticut, where Ruth Shapley Brown speaks of her passion.
I'm Executive Director of Connecticut Gravestone Network, and most of our membership is very involved in just protecting the history that's in our older cemeteries, our colonial and Puritan times, because most of those cemeteries are very small. Some of them are out in rural areas. Many of them don't have any clear boundaries. And we also have a large problem with trying to protect unmarked graves. What our members do is put in a lot of volunteer effort, a lot of volunteer time in all of their own communities with trying to keep records, research different various names, working with various genealogists to try to keep this information from becoming invisible to the future.
In the village of Flower Hill, New York, a grassroots effort led by Mayor Charles Weiss has gained momentum and public support. Just steps from Town Hall, Mayor Weiss discovered an unmarked plot of land. It was an unbuildable lot wedged between a bustling boulevard and a country club. It had sat neglected for decades, filled with litter and refuse. It was discovered to be an abandoned cemetery. Mayor Weiss initiated a comprehensive review of land records and discovered there was no living relative to speak for any of the interred.
When we realized that the cemetery was in the village and was not being kept up, we did a search, ultimately authorized a title search, and traced title back to the mid-1600s. And we realized that the last known heir of the property of which the cemetery was a part died in 1926. The property, therefore, sits alone, unclaimed by anyone, and doesn't show on the tax records as being owned by anyone. When we discovered the cemetery and realized that there were graves there dating back several hundred years, we felt that the cemetery needed to be maintained. We were sorry for the neglectful state that it was in. And so we commenced proceedings to take ownership of the property so that we could clean it up properly, maintain it properly, restore the gravestones, and show reverence and respect for the people who lived there a long time ago and are part of our history.
Across the Verrazano Narrows Bridge on the far side of Staten Island, a neglected cemetery has been desecrated and vandalized for decades. It was all but forgotten until Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries adopted it, an organization whose sole purpose is to restore neglected cemeteries. Ordinary citizens like Lynn Rogers have worked tirelessly to champion their restoration.
Well, about 13 years ago, when I was pregnant with my daughter, I started to do genealogy research on Staten Island, and I found ancestors buried in cemeteries that I had never heard of, nor did anybody in my family ever hear of them. And when I went to find the cemeteries, I found them overgrown, and I was referred to a group called the Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries of Staten Island.
She found a cemetery in shambles that over the years had become a garbage dump. It was cleared of debris and trash.
We operate on a shoestring budget. We rely on donations, grants, and contributions. We also have a heavy in-kind and volunteer operation.
Another cemetery that disintegrated into a squatter's refuge was restored to some degree of deserved dignity. During a genealogy search, Ms. Rogers discovered the grave of a veteran who fought and died at Gettysburg. She had a plaque fabricated and a marker placed to honor him.
We have a very difficult time funding the restoration of over 40 acres of cemetery property and 19 Staten Island cemeteries. Our major contributor is the Richmond County Savings Foundation, but we mainly rely on donations, contributions, and in-kind services.
Simply clearing weeds and underbrush can sometimes be enough to transform an eyesore.
Well, a lot of the work is done through volunteers, and we're fortunate to have the use of the Arthur Kill Correctional Facility outside community service team, which comes out 10 or 12 men strong from the prison, and they'll spend days maintaining the cemeteries. The volunteers come and go, and it's nice when we have them, but you can't rely on it.
Abandoned churches are often situated adjacent to some of these cemeteries, but they do not own them. Once the last surviving relative of the interred has died, there is no one left to maintain the cemetery, and the burden then falls to municipalities. The thought of a cemetery being abandoned one day has many considering cremation as an alternative to burial.
Over the years, cremation has become an increasingly viable alternative to both below-ground burial and above-ground entombment. Here in the United States, cremation can be dated back to the early 1800s. And today, society chooses cremation for any number of reasons. Here in the United States, it may be the lesser costs as opposed to burial, fear of the burial itself, or the social concern of cemeteries running out of room in the future. No matter the reason, cremation is a personal choice. Choosing cremation does not lessen the importance for remembrance and memorialization. We as a people still hold the funeral and its ceremonies necessary for grieving and mourning.
In the United States, cremation was the method of disposition in 36% of deaths in 2008. Cremation is projected to rise to 58% by the year 2025. England recorded only 3 cremations in 1885. The practice has steadily increased, so that in 2001, cremation was the method of disposition in 70% of deaths. In Japan, over 99% of dispositions are by cremation.
The Church has accommodated cremation since 1963 with the belief that many people found cremation to be desirous for them for different reasons. Some felt that they wanted to be environmentally friendly, they wanted to be green, and they thought that cremation was a better way to go. Others have chosen it for economic reasons. The important thing to remember for Catholics is that cremation may never be chosen as any kind of a rejection of the Church's teaching of the resurrection or call to traditional burial. And even when one is cremated as a Catholic, one is still required, or it is the preference of the Church, that this person still have the cremains, the remains of the ashes and the bones that are in the urn, to have those cremains entombed in a niche or buried in a grave, as a continuation of respect for the human body.
The choice between interment and cremation is made more urgent when reminded that the world population is more than 6 billion people, and it is expected to rise to 10 billion by the year 2050. The spectrum of American cemeteries extends from the well-financed military to the abandoned. Traditional religious and non-sectarian cemeteries continue to serve, but they are filling up at an alarming pace. While cremation is a viable alternative and gaining wider appeal as a method of disposition, the question remains: who will assume the financial responsibility of maintaining the world's cemeteries?
Sir William Gladstone immortalized these words: "Show me the manner in which a nation cares for its dead, and I will measure in mathematical detail the tender mercies as a people, their respect for the laws of the land, and their loyalty to high ideals."